Minister.
Meanwhile, the prominent Remain campaigner Dominic Grieve has received a vote of no confidence from his local Conservative association in Buckinghamshire. Members in Beaconsfield voted by 182 to 131 against the former Attorney General, who supports a second public vote on Brexit. Earlier, he gave this response to the confidence vote.
I've been the MP for 22 years. I have good relations with my association, good relations with my association members. I also know that Brexit is very divisive, and I know that there are people who I know and respect who disagree with me, and they're entitled to come and express their views, and they're also entitled, if they feel it's absolutely necessary, to refuse to express confidence in me. And this was a confidence motion last night tabled by my officers rather than a no confidence motion. So, I have to be prepared for that, and that's a legitimate part of the political process, and each MP has to face up to that. But last night there were also present quite a large number of people who clearly come with one fixed objective only, and it appeared to be, from all the surrounding evidence, an orchestrated and organised campaign, which seems to have required signing lots of people up to my association over quite a short period of time, and led by a particular individual who happens to have been the UKIP candidate who stood against me in 2017.
Meanwhile, in response to the government failing to get its withdrawal agreement passed for a third time yesterday, Mr Grieve had this advice for the Prime Minister.
What I would urge her to do is to listen to what the House of Commons is saying. I mean, I do appreciate that she has put a huge amount of personal effort, energy, in difficult circumstances, to trying to craft a deal for our exit from the EU that seeks to reconcile what she saw as the instructions, rather vague instructions that the result of the referendum had given, with minimising the risks. But the difficulty she has is that she's ended up with something which just looks second-rate for our country's future. And this, oddly enough, is an assessment both made by ex-Remainers or Remainers and people who are, wanting to leave and want a form of hard Brexit. The difficulty is, where do we go from here? The truth is, we're talking now about something that is totally different from the visions that were being promoted in 2016. My personal view is that the sensible thing is to go back and ask the public if they want her deal and if the alternative could be Remain. I'm also prepared to consider other alternatives.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has been reacting to the events of the past few days and has once again been criticising Theresa May for her handling of Brexit.
This is becoming a long-running saga. She was supposed to have brought the vote on December the 11th, pulled it, put it at the end of January and lost by the largest ever majority. A government was defeated in parliamentary history, brought it back again, then again, and is now going to apparently try it again next week. This is beyond ridiculous. There is a clear proposal there that we negotiate a customs union with Europe, which will then protect the whole issue of the border in Northern Ireland, that we negotiate trade access and, above all, a dynamic protection of rights so we don't fall below Europe on it, because I suspect there's a whole agenda there in the Tory party which would want to see workers' rights and consumer rights and environmental protections diminished. We'll put our proposals again to Parliament next week.
So indicative votes again on Monday?
Indicative votes on Monday.
Are you confident that you can get a majority in the Commons in favour of that plan, in favour of a customs union?
We're working very hard on that and reaching out to people all across the Commons, and I've been doing that all this week, and obviously we're doing that all this weekend. This is a very dangerous period, because if we crash out without a deal, then the supply chains get interrupted, jobs are at stake, and also the sense of security of many European Union nationals living in Britain and, of course, British people living across Europe. But we have been reaching out a lot. Indeed, I had a very good discussion with the government of Spain to ensure protection of British nationals living there.
Are you concerned at all that with the clock running down, that and the Commons debating what might be a softer Brexit, that Brexiteers now, as much as they don't like Theresa May's deal, may well end up backing it and it will get through?
Well, whoever people voted in the referendum, nobody voted to lose their jobs, nobody voted to be worse off, and nobody voted to deregulate our society. I think that the obvious choice is what I've suggested, which would be a good economic relationship with Europe, of which can be negotiated. And I'm convinced of that, having spent a lot of time meeting with and talking to officials in Europe.
And do you still think that any deal that comes out of the Commons, any proposal that comes from the Commons, should be put to a confirmatory referendum with Remain on the ballot?
Well, this was exactly what our conference discussed last year, and obviously that is the Labour position. So far there hasn't been enough support for that across the floor in the House of Commons. But the priority, the absolute priority at the moment, is to end this chaos that this government has brought us to by their endlessly running down the clock and basically bullying and threatening people. The bullying hasn't worked, the threats hasn't worked. It's time now for the sensible people to take over.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the Labour MP, Rupa Huck. Rupa, we've got more of these indicative votes coming up this week on Monday. Given that MPs in the Commons couldn't agree on any way forward last week, isn't the same likely to happen again with no obvious way forward?
Well, I do think things are different this week to last, because her deal has been rejected again by another thumping, great big majority of MPs who don't want it. So, I mean, last week the government was saying they're going to ignore it, and they've got this habit of ignoring stuff. 1 million people marching on the streets for a people's vote, 6 million people now that have signed a petition, not just for a people's vote, but to completely unilaterally revoke Article 50. I think they can't keep ignoring stuff. They're a minority government, for pity's sake.
But so, for someone who campaigned and strongly favours remaining in the EU yourself, by not backing the withdrawal agreement, doesn't that increase the risk of this April the 12th deadline approaching and potentially the UK leaving without a deal at all?
Well, look, I mean, I want best for the country as opposed to best for the Conservative Party, which is what this whole exercise seems to have been about, keeping her fractured party together. So, I mean, remember how people used to say we'll get the exact same benefits. People used to say this is the easiest deal in history, it's going to be £350 million every week for the NHS. They need us more than we need them. No one says that anymore. It's now turned into averting catastrophe. So personally, I don't want to go for a second best thing if we can completely remain full members of the EU. But the stuff on Monday, I mean, again, the headlines are saying last week it was no, 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 no. But, I mean, there are certain options that commanded more votes than others, and that kind of shows where the House of Commons is going. So customs union was a popular one, but also the indicative vote that carried the most MPs' votes was actually to put back whatever is decided at the end of all this, and we still don't know what it's going to be. We're no clearer, really, even though the Prime Minister said she'll fall on her sword at some unspecified time. Having a confirmatory vote at the end of all it versus where we can remain, because we know what that looks like and we know it works.
The other, you mentioned there the idea of a people's vote, putting to the public in a referendum whatever deal is on offer versus remaining. We saw some very angry protests on the 29th yesterday, the day the UK was due to leave, and there will be people who feel betrayed by saying, you know, those who want out of the EU will feel betrayed by rerunning a vote on an issue that they say has been voted on and settled.
Well, look, I mean, we have to have a version of leave that's workable, that's deliverable, that's achievable. And a lot of these other things that have been talked about are just unicorns, pretty much. They won't work in practice because we've had 45 years of legislative alignment and regulatory enmeshing with the EU. So it's easier said than done to just completely pull out. You know, it's a bit like extracting an egg from a cake that's already baked. So, I mean, I think if we have an achievable, workable thing, and the Prime Minister's deal, I voted against it 3 times, but at least we know it's sanctioned by the EU and it would work in practice. Just, you know, we don't like certain aspects of it. So if it's that or if it's whatever else is decided on Monday, I think, you know, it's quite traditional in trade union agreements to have the status quo, and we certainly know that that does allow our country to function.
One of the other ideas that is being increasingly talked about is a general election. Do you support that?
I mean, that's our party policy. For ages, we've just had this logjam, gridlock,
but does
stalemate.
That not create more uncertainty, though?
So, I mean, the thing is, I think this lot have been incompetent. They're incapable. And Theresa May, I mean, there comes a time when being a bloody difficult woman becomes a liability, to be frank. So she's had these red lines she's put in place. She won't budge. She is leader of a minority government. In those circumstances, you should reach across the aisle and make friendships, not look at the people behind that are trying to stab you in the back anyway.
So on that point, then, if there were to be a general election and Labour decided it was going to stand on a ticket of honouring the referendum decision to leave, as someone who passionately believes in remaining, Could you run on a Labour ticket then?
Well, look, I mean, the Labour Party is a democratic party, so its policies aren't decided by one person. And in September, we had the conference, and there was this motion thrashed out by hundreds of people in a room for hours, and they decided to go through different options. It's a sort of exhaustive, some people might say exhausting policy, but we try for a Labour version of Brexit with a customs union and close alignment to the single market. Then, you know, if that doesn't work, you know, it goes through different stages, and we've not ruled out a people's vote. In fact, we had it in our motion the other day. We all voted for a people's vote. So I still think that whatever it is that comes out of this, because, you know, our manifesto last time, we didn't win that election, and that's also a message to Theresa May. She keeps saying she has to honour her manifesto. The bits about fox hunting they were going to bring back, they've junked that. The dementia tax, the death tax that caused them so much bother, they've junked that. So they've chucked the rest of the manifesto. They didn't win, so they're not duty-bound to honour that. So I think that, yeah, to get out of this mess, we need either a people's vote or an election is another way of doing it, yeah.
OK, Rupa, thanks for coming in. Good to get your thoughts. Rupa Hook there. Thank you.